It's common knowledge that Russian literature is rich in incredible stories. Some of them tragic, other ones harrowing, but all of them seem to reflect what it means to be alive. They probe deep into the essence of the human condition. And so today, I want to share with you 5 Russian stories that do just that and that are well worth your time. The first book is a novel that I always recommend whenever someone messages me and says, "Hey, I've read Dostoevsky, I've read Tolstoy, who should I read next?" My answer is always Oblomov by Ivan Goncharov. And this novel depicts a reoccurring archetype within Russian literature known as Lishny Человек, which is the superfluous man. And this is shown through our protagonist, Ilya Ilyich Oblomov. And he is this indolent, milquetoast man who has been raised in luxury. He's raised in the upper class, he's a wealthy man, but he lives his life and spends the first 80 pages of this book lying in bed, failing to enact himself in the world, and really just centering himself around a world of pleasure, relaxation, and laziness. In fact, his name Oblomov has been used and kind of incorporated into regular Russian language as Oblomov, Oblomovism, as someone who is just being lazy or being indolent. But far more than just depicting the sloth-like character, Oblomov explores the perennial question of nature versus nurture. Is he capable of changing his ways and who he is? And Stoltz, his dear friend who was raised with a German father, has this. He's an ambitious individual. He has this pragmatism to him, and he's able to motivate Oblomov at different points in the novel to try and change his life, get out of bed, make something of himself, chase this ideal life, work and pursue something, pour himself into some kind of passion or even love with the beautiful, vivacious Olga. But repeatedly, no matter who's holding his hand and dragging him along, when he's left to his own devices, Oblomov persistently regresses and fails to make any kind of permanent change. And it really makes one think about fate and free will, and are we truly capable of changing our essence and who we truly are, our nature? But even beyond that, there's beautiful passages that contain a lot of profound statements and arguments about work-life balance. What is the ideal life? Is it one spent with absolute pleasure, hedonism, and peace and tranquility? Or is it one spent striving, pursuing? And when is that too much? When is a life full of work too much? So it really makes one consider this. And I think this is a really relevant question today about work-life balance, especially in the state of hustle culture in this state world. But even beyond the heavier questions, this novel is full of humor and comedic bits, satire, and the characters are very lively, very affable. And even though Oblomov constantly may frustrate you throughout the work, you find yourself rooting for him and having some level of sympathy for this poor character. But it's a phenomenal novel. I've called it one of the forgotten masterpieces, not because no one's ever heard of it, but because compared to Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy, even Chekhov, it's not as common. It's not as commonly spoken about, and I think it deserves far more praise. The next Russian story you need to read is Chanel or the Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol. And although this work is only about 40 pages long, it is so multi-layered, so rich in symbolism and satire. In fact, I read it this past weekend and I completely forgot how funny this work is and how funny Gogol is. Now, some of the comedy is also draped or intertwined with tragedy, but those things are always, go hand in hand in a lot of ways. But this story follows a non-entity of a character named Akaky Akakievich Bashmachkin, which if you dissect that name, Akaki means harmless or lacking evil, and his family name Bashmachkin comes from Bashmak, which means shoe. So you can kind of get the idea of what Google is trying to put forth here or convey is that this is a kind of character that just gets walked on. He is, Akaki is meant to simply fulfill bureaucratic duties and obligations. He's living to simply live, work, sleep, and repeat. And we see this in very satirical description of the character when it says, quote, "The child was christened, and during the ceremony he burst into tears and made such a face, it was plain that he knew there and then that he was fated to be a titular counselor." And if you aren't familiar what a titular counselor is, it is a very low-ranking civil servant within the order of rank in Russia at the time. It's basically you're just doing very menial tasks and you have very little chance of advancing in rank or really doing much with your life. It's a very kind of, again, mundane or banal existence. And then later on, quote, subsequently, everyone came to believe that he had come into this world already equipped for his job, complete with uniform and bald patch. So we have this non-entity that is really just living to work and working to live. He's not asserting himself. He's not imprinting himself on the world, living passionately, really doing much with his life. He just simply copies documents, and when they ask him to do anything else, he prefers just to stick to the mundane, the monotony that he's used to and comfortable with. Beyond Gogol's humorous description of our protagonist, we also see that Akaki is just belittled and treated like dirt by his fellow co-workers and citizens. But once he gets this incredible, custom-tailored, custom-made overcoat, everything for him changes. It's this momentous event in his life where he starts to think, maybe I can make something of myself, because he gets all this attention for his overcoat. People are starting to treat him different and talk to him different, and he's invited to this party. But unfortunately, on his way home, his overcoat is stolen. And I'll save the rest of the story for you all when you read it. But one aspect I do have to mention is that when he's searching for his overcoat, he's sent on this absurd wild goose chase, going from door to door, person to person, all of them, each officer or superintendent or investigator, unable to help him, just deferring him to another ineffective individual until he gets to this all-important person, as he's known, which just rejects him as well. And it really makes me think of Kafka's Story of the Castle, or even The Trial, just all these bureaucratic, ineffective steps that just leave the actual individual helpless. But it's an incredible story. One of my favorite Russian short stories. And just like any Gogol story, there are just so many levels to it. And it's quite an enjoyable story as well, because you're just going to be cracking up at some of the characters or dialogue along the way. The next story just might be one of the funniest books I've ever read, and that is 19 Stulyev, or The 12 Chairs, by Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov. This is a blistering adventure full of slapstick humor. You're following a greedy clerk, Ippolit, who teams up with this sly, conniving, brazen hero of the story, Ostap Bender. And they're searching all throughout Russia on this mission to find these hidden jewels, ultra valuable jewels that were sewn into one of 12 family chairs. The story is very fast paced, and it introduces you to a cast of ridiculous characters. All of them seem to mock or satirize some kind of Russian persona at the time, whether it's the hypocritical, greedy priest that is also chasing after these jewels, or whether it's the willingness for these characters to believe in and join this fake secret society, the Alliance of the Sword and Plowshare. I just found myself cracking up throughout pretty much every chapter of this book. It's one I recommend a lot, and I definitely plan to read much more of Ilf and Petrov in the future, as long as I can find them. They're quite hard to find, but you should be able to find this edition or a newer edition from Northwestern University Press. Speaking of works that are deeply rooted to the historical period that they were written in, is Kotlovann, The Foundation Pit by Andrei Platonov. And this book follows a group of laborers, some of them idealists and believers in Bolshevism, and others suicidal nihilists that are digging this foundation pit as part of this rapid industrialization occurring in the Soviet Union immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution. This is part of the 5-year plan, which not only included industrialization policies, but also policies of collectivization. And you see how grim, brutal, and morbid the consequences of such collectivization were, both with Ukrainians and peasantry, dekulakization, and just the othering and dehumanizing effects and ideologies of communism, specifically within the Soviet Union. And throughout the story, a lot of the characters, even if they're pessimistic, they do cling to some bit of hope. And they have their hope symbolized and personified in this girl Nastya, who stays with them, because she's supposed to represent the future generation of Soviet children that are supposed to reap the benefits for the sacrifices and the horrid existence that they're currently living in. But as the plot in the story kind of unravels and moves on further, and as things get worse and worse, and the bodies just seem to stack around them, even zealous idealists like Safronov start to lose hope and doubt, and see the irrationality of this ideology and movement, and recognize it for what it is, just empty, fake promises. You're forced to sacrifice and bleed for this faceless conglomerate that is the Soviet Union, and yet it's just endless suffering and despair. And yet, even with that, the laborers continue to dig deeper and deeper. And it really makes me think of how the Soviet Union, even through Golodomor and these turbulent times and consistent wars, they continue to push further and further and further. It really reminds me of this foundation pit that is, the allegory or parable within this work of how it has to be dug further and further and further. And they're kind of losing themselves in this pursuit that they know is fruitless. Quote, now the foundation pit must be dug broader and deeper still. A little bit further down, the collective farm was following him and without stopping was digging the earth. All the poor and middle peasants were working with such zeal of life as if they were seeking to save themselves forever in the abyss of the foundation pit. It's a very grim and bleak novel to read, but rich in history, rich in symbolism, a very enlightening work. And if you want to read more, I have a full written review as well that'll link in the description. And the last Russian story that I recommend you read is Nitocka Nezvanova by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a short story of his, or an unfinished novella, I should say, that doesn't really get mentioned that often. And understandably so. It has moments where it is brilliant and really shines and puts forth, conveys these really profound, illuminating ideas. And then there's other parts that just seem, as the novel is, unfinished. And you wonder where it was headed in some aspects. But this story primarily is told through the narrative eyes of this miserable girl, Nitocka. And her stepfather, Yefimov, is this failed musician. He's this violinist who really had so much potential in his youth. He was trained by this marvelous virtuoso, and he the problem is he lacks the discipline and the endurance, and he fails to really take the leap. And I think that's where I really love and connect with the story, and I suspect a lot of you will as well. It's not just the idea of failed potential, but failed potential because we fear of taking the leap and finding out that we're not as great as we think we are. And we'd rather rest on our laurels, dream about the glory days of what we could have done. We'd rather reflect and tell people, well, I could have been a bestseller if I really wanted to, or if I really, tried it, or if I, was ever given the opportunity, I could, sell out a stadium or be this elite violinist. We'd rather indulge ourselves in these dreams and these ideas we tell ourselves rather than put ourselves into the actual situations and pursue this, because that requires you really take action and have potential for failure. I think this quote puts it a little bit more succinctly than I am. Quote, he flattered himself with this notion because he was one of those people who were very fond of seeing themselves among the insulted and injured, of complaining aloud about it and finding secret comfort in gloating over their unrecognized genius. We like to imagine that we are some unrecognized genius. We just weren't given the right opportunity or chance. And we'd rather sit and, again, soak in that idea rather than enact ourselves in the world. And this quote really brings it home. Quote, you sensed that you should be following a different path, a more ambitious one. You felt that you were destined for other things, but you had no idea how to achieve them. And in your misery, you began to hate everything around you. And that's what we see with this stepfather, who just, his resentment and anger at the world and really reluctance to turn it upon himself and recognize that he is really the one behind his own misery and failed potential. Instead, he turns this grief and contempt for himself, for the world, onto Nitocka and onto her mother, and really, steals from them, abuses them, and like any Dostoevsky story, all of these characters are not simply what I just spoke. They're very multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and although that this is unfinished, I found it to be a very short but well worthwhile read. So that's it. 5 stories, some of them you've likely never heard of, that are all a very rewarding and fascinating read. Russian literature is just full of complexity and, again, harrowing, but also hopeful and optimistic story. And that's, I think, the essence of the Russian spirit is the ability to be resilient, to adapt to despair and horrific pressure and environments, and still remain hopeful, still have this glimmer of hope and optimism and this metal within them. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you've read these stories or if I've given you some recommendations, read them, come back, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear them. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe, share it with friends, and I will see you all in the next one.